Right, hi everybody, welcome back. Um, in this video, I want to move on to topic 4.4, which is the subject of water pollution. It's the last topic in topic 4, water and aquatic food production systems and societies, which is quite a mouthful. It's quite a diverse topic overall. Um, what I thought for topic 4.4 is it would be probably better to split it up into separate sections. I'm thinking of doing possibly 4 separate videos about that. So in this video, I want to discuss the types of water pollution. So hopefully I won't spend too long on that. In a second one, I'd like to look at how we measure water pollution. In a third one, we can look at the water pollution management strategies, how we prevent water pollution and how we clean it up if it happens. And then I thought I might do a short separate video on one very specific topic that always seems to come up in the IB exams, which is eutrophication, which is pollution caused by nutrients being released into water. Okay, so I'll go through many types of water pollution, but I thought maybe the best way to talk in this video is to look specifically at case studies. I narrowed it down to 4 case studies I'd like to look at specifically because I think they look at the different aspects of water pollution quite well. So number 1, I want to look at organic pollution, specifically what happens to water that receives sewage from sewage plants. Number 2, you might remember we've seen this before, I want to look at the Minamata disaster or Minamata disease, which was a disease you might remember which caused by the release of heavy metals into a bay in Japan. And those heavy metals got into the food chain and were consumed by humans. And then I want to look at what I still think is regarded as the worst oil spill disaster of all time, which is the Exxon Valdez disaster of 1989, which was a huge oil spill from an oil tanker in Alaska. And then finally, I want to look at a very specific type of pollution, which is that caused by synthetic chemicals. So things like plasticizers, which are chemicals you put into plastics to harden them, and things like drugs, which can be released into water either directly or through sewage when they're peed out by humans after they've taken those drugs. Specifically, I want to look at what happens to the products that are released from the contraceptive pill, because those are chemicals that affect the hormone system or the endocrine system and are therefore referred to as endocrine disruptors. Endocrine is the hormone system. Okay, I'll try and speed rapidly through this part, but knowing me, I'll get stuck on a few things. Okay, so this is the syllabus. It's very straightforward. They're just really lists of pollutants, and we need to understand what they are. So first of all, an obvious statement. The IB says that there are many freshwater and marine pollution sources. Possibly a good time here to remind you that there are 2 types of pollution which apply here. Either point source pollution, where you can identify a very specific source of a pollutant, or diffuse pollution, where it enters water from many, many different sources and you can't identify a single origin for that pollution. Then the IB lists the type of pollutants they want us to know about. You can read through that, but on the next slide I've made this list again, and we'll go through them in a little bit of detail. And then very specifically they pick out one type of pollutant, and we need to describe what effect it has on water, which can be very, very drastic, which is organic pollution. And I'll focus there on sewage pollution. Organic material, if you're a biologist, you'll know that are compounds made up specifically of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, amongst a few other things. So they're actually biodegradable pollutants, but the process of biodegradation can lead to problems itself in water bodies. So that's what we need to look at there. Under applications and skills, they want us to be able to look at water pollution data and analyse it. But I won't show you data here. We'll do that in the classroom when we look at specifically past paper questions. Okay, so here's my list of pollutants, or the IB list of pollutants as promised. I've changed the order because I've put the ones that I want to specifically focus on in the top 4 or 5 here. Okay, so very quickly, we need to look at organic material, toxic metals. We look specifically at the Minamata disaster there. Oil, I'll look at the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Synthetic compounds, we'll look at endocrine disruptors there. Then inorganic plant nutrients, which lead to eutrophication. I've already said that we'll look at that in a separate video, the process of eutrophication itself. Then other things you might not readily think about. Release of radioactivity. I was very tempted to do another case study here, but then I thought this video would go on too long. We could have looked very specifically at disasters like the Fukushima disaster in Japan, which released a lot of radioactive material at the time from a nuclear power station. Then things you might not think of readily, floating debris, but you're probably familiar with pictures of floating plastics and microplastics, specifically in the Pacific these days. Suspended solids, which can have a big effect on water bodies, which are basically just small particles that obscure the water, make it very dark. Hot water. You can introduce hot water to water bodies and the temperature change can have a big effect on an ecosystem. Pathogens. Human activity specifically can release microorganisms and disease-bearing microorganisms into water bodies. That links back to sewage pollution, but we might look at that separately. And then strange things like light pollution, noise pollution. And interestingly, the IB has listed as a pollutant the release of alien species or invasive species into new habitats, which we've already looked at. But that's an interesting way to look at it in terms of a pollutant. Okay, so case studies. I'll try and go through this quickly, and I hope I give you enough detail to understand what I'm trying to say. All right, organic water pollution. So these are organic materials containing largely carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. This is a sewage outfall, so releasing treated sewage into a river. Even treated sewage has huge amounts of organic material left over. So it includes things like human waste, fats, natural oils, and other chemicals like pesticides, although we could also link those to synthetic chemicals as well. You might think that they might be harmful because being organic, they can be biodegraded, but the process of biodegradation, in certain conditions can lead to big problems in water bodies. Specifically under anaerobic conditions, which means low oxygen conditions, certain bacteria, as they degrade these products, using them as food, produce dangerous byproducts and poisonous byproducts like methane, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia, which can kill wildlife living in the water body. So you might be familiar with these pictures of huge deaths of, or huge die-offs of fish. And that's very often due to the release of these products by certain bacteria. That's not the end of the story, because as organic material biodegrades, the microorganisms and bacteria that are biodegrading it take oxygen out of the water, reducing the dissolved oxygen in the water, and that can have another huge effect on animals that live in the water, especially fish, and that can lead to huge die-offs as well. The problem is worse in summer, because at higher temperatures, less oxygen dissolves in water under higher temperatures, so it exacerbates the problem even more. There's even less oxygen available for aquatic organisms. Okay, so that's a flying visit to organic water pollution. This is Minamata disease. Now, we have talked about this before, so very briefly, just to recap. It was a disease in the local population. It wasn't understood what was causing it until 1958, when it was identified that a factory in Minamata Bay was releasing methyl mercury into the water supply. So that's the heavy metal mercury attached to a methyl or carbon group. So the factory started in the 1930s, releasing this poisonous byproducts into the water. It was bioaccumulated first of all in shellfish, and then as other animals in the food chain, it biomagnified up the food chain. Please remember there's a difference between bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So the animals worst hit were the animals at the top of the food chain, and that obviously also included the human population that was eating shellfish and fish caught in the bay. The effect of mercury on the nervous system of animals, including humans, is that the mercury attaches to nerve cells and it's not released. So the buildup of mercury on nerve cells means that the person that it affects can't control their movements anymore. The effect was either that it led to people just being frozen, unable to move, or in some cases having uncontrollable movements and spasms. And it was labelled Minamata Disease because that's where it happened, but nobody knew what was causing it. So as I said, it was discovered in 1958. The Japanese government put sanctions on the company to make them clean up the waste and clean up the bay. It seemed that's what happened, but later it was discovered that the steps that they took to mitigate the pollution problem were pretty useless. And it still continued until 1968, when I think the factory was closed down. So that's a very, very sad story of what happened in Minamata. Although it was called Minamata disease, it certainly wasn't the only place where it happened. It was just the place where they discovered the source. And there were several other places in Japan alone where the same problem happened due to the same pollution, the same pollutant. Okay. Next one is the Exxon Valdez disaster. I remember this very well. I was probably a bit younger than you are now. I won't tell you how old I am when it happened. It was the time when news channels were just taking off and 24 News was just hitting the televisions days before the internet. And it had a big effect on everybody that saw it because nobody had really seen a disaster like that before. Certainly not broadcast live on the international news. So in March 1989, this ship, or this oil tanker, it left Valdez, Alaska, and it was heading to California with 53 million tons of crude oil aboard. When it got to Prince William Sound in Alaska, for a few reasons, the ship hit a reef and it was holed, and a lot of oil was released from the ship. I believe 11 million tons were released before it could be contained, and before they could basically plug the hole in the tanker. So it wasn't the biggest oil spill of all time. I think that record is still held by the deliberate release of oil by Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War in Kuwait. But it certainly had one of the worst effects on a pristine ecosystem and the wildlife that lived there. You can see the pictures there. So 37,000 metric tons of oil were lost, and it affected about 2,000 kilometres of coastline. Exxon blamed the captain, who was supposedly drunk at the time, but he was later cleared. He wasn't even on the bridge at the time. And it seemed the big problem was that the company was running these ships without proper radar. In fact, I believe the Valdez had a radar system that was broken, and the company thought it was too expensive to fix and run. So it was running without radar, and so I guess the accident was inevitable. So Exxon ended up paying about, I believe, $2 billion in damages to put towards cleanup, and a further $1.8 billion to try to restore the habitat. But it was never really successful, and there are still effects today, after all this time, that you can see on that environment, and there's still patches of oil on the coastline. There was a huge clean operation was attempted. A lot of it was about trying to protect the image of the company at the time. It was one of the biggest oil companies in the world, Exxon. Many methods were used to try to clean up. That included putting floating booms around the ship to try to contain the oil so it didn't hit the coastline. They physically skimmed the oil off the water and scrubbed it off rocks. Also, unfortunately, a huge amount of detergents were used to try to break up the oil, and it turned out that a lot of those detergents had a worse effect than the oil itself. And you can see here a lot of high pressure water hosing was used to try to clean off the oil from the rocks. But in doing so, that killed huge amounts of animals like barnacles and algae, plants that otherwise might have survived. So, in a lot of ways, the cleanup operation had a worse effect than would have happened by doing nothing. Maybe one good thing that came out of it was that scientists were able to study the methods that they used. They used different methods on different parts of the coastline, and that scientific study was useful in working out the best ways to deal with these kind of spills in the future. So unfortunately, just before I start recording this, I made a list of the effects. It's estimated that about 250,000 seabirds were killed, about 3,000 sea otters, 300 seals, 250 bald eagles, and around 22 killer whales were found dead. It had a huge effect on the salmon and herring fishery in Prince William Sound, and soon after, in the early 1990s, the fishery in that area collapsed completely. It's not known if it would have collapsed anyway because it was overfished, like we saw in the previous video. But certainly the oil spill exacerbated the collapse of that fishery. If one other good thing came out of the disaster, it was that I think it was George Bush Sr. at the time, passed new US legislation to try to prevent similar accidents in the future. So penalties were increased on oil companies for things like this happening. And all oil tankers operating in the US from that point onwards had to have double hulls, so they had a better chance of surviving a grounding or hitting a reef, similar to that. The European Union passed similar legislation in 2002, I believe. Right. I found out actually what happened to the ship afterwards. It was fixed up and it was sold to a Chinese company. And it carried on sailing until 2012, where it was eventually scrapped. Obviously, it was operating under a different name during that time. Okay, and then my final case study, something that's quite close to my heart because I was a researcher and this was my PhD subject. I looked at, when I was a researcher, specifically the chemicals produced, the chemicals that come from the female contraceptive pill. Okay, so I've said here, many pharmaceuticals and other things, other chemicals like additives to plastics, have big effects on the human hormone system, but also the hormone system of animals, especially fish. In the contraceptive pill, the active substance is an estrogen called ethinyl estradiol. It has the effect of preventing women from ovulating, but it also is very persistent in the body and outside the body. And when somebody that's on the pill goes to the bathroom, they pee out basically unaffected ethinyl estradiol. It passes to drainage systems, to sewage works, and eventually to water bodies, where it can have an effect on animals. And if it gets into water drinking systems, eventually possibly on humans. Okay, so in terms of effects of these things, which are called endocrine disruptors, including ethinyl estradiol, the observed effects are feminization of male fish. That doesn't mean that male fish turn female, although that does happen in some fish species. What it means is, very specific effect is that male fish don't grow a sperm tube out to the outside of the body, so they can't spawn, they can't produce sperm and put it out into the water. And other strange effects are eggs or egg proteins start to grow in the testicles of male fish, so they become less able to reproduce, less able to spawn. There were huge effects actually in the 1990s and early 2000s in UK rivers, but it seems like there wasn't a big effect in other places like the US. That might just be because of the small size of UK rivers compared to US rivers and the effect of dilution. So it's been studied for quite a while. It's not just, by the way, rivers. The Mediterranean Sea, it seems like this feminization effect has been recorded in fish in the Mediterranean. And it's not just fish, it's other animals. So I don't know I should say this, but one of the studies that caught my eye when I was a researcher is there was a huge study in Florida where people found effects on the reproductive capability of alligators in the Everglades. And one brave group of researchers started in the 1990s measuring the penis size of alligators. It would take a brave person than me to want to do that for a living, I can tell you. And there's other effects possibly, although cause and effect is difficult to prove, on human sperm counts. And it has been recorded a decreasing sperm count in men in Northern Europe. So that's synthetic chemicals and endocrine disruptors. Right, I'm sure I've gone on far too long and longer than I intended, as usual. But I hope those case studies, well, I've said 3 case studies plus the effects of organic pollution, are useful. I will speak to you in the class where we'll talk a bit more about the effects of water pollution. All right, take care, everybody, and look after yourselves, and please look out for my next video coming very soon to YouTube. All right, bye-bye.